The roar of engines shattered the calm of the gas station as a gang of bikers pulled in. Their leather jackets bore the insignia of menace, their sneers daring anyone to defy them. Among the patrons was a solitary woman, tall and poised, filling up her dusty sedan. They laughed, jeered, and one leaned too close. "Hey, sweetheart," he growled. "Need a hand?" Her cold smile froze them. They had no idea they'd just picked a fight with the wrong lady. The woman, whose name was Elena, appeared unremarkable to the casual observer. She had come to this remote highway station for solitude, not a confrontation. But as the bikers' leader, a towering brute named Jax, stepped closer, her fingers twitched slightly, a motion she hadn't made in years. Jax's voice was gravelly as he taunted, "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here alone?" Elena didn't flinch. "Just passing through," she said, her tone neutral. The gang erupted in laughter, their mockery echoing in the stillness. What they couldn't see were the subtle shifts in Elena's posture, a predator coiling to strike. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo slithering up his neck, moved to block Elena's path. "You're not going anywhere just yet," he sneered, reaching for her keys. In a blur of motion, Elena's hand shot out, striking the pressure point on his wrist. He yelped, dropping her keys as his knees buckled. "Don't," she said simply, her voice steely and calm. The gang's laughter ceased, replaced by a tense silence. Jax stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow over Elena. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you just made a big mistake." "You don't know the first thing about me," Elena replied, her eyes locked onto his. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the sound of crickets in the distance blending with the muted hum of an idling engine. Then Jax lunged. Elena sidestepped effortlessly, her movements fluid and precise. She brought her elbow up, driving it into his ribcage with enough force to make him stagger. The gang surged forward, but Elena was ready. Years of training kicked in as she moved like a whirlwind, striking with precision and speed. Her small frame belied her strength and agility as she neutralized one biker after another. A burly man with a scar running down his cheek swung a heavy chain at her, but she ducked under it, sweeping his legs out from beneath him. Another grabbed at her from behind, but Elena twisted, using his momentum against him to throw him to the ground. She moved with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice, every strike calculated to incapacitate without killing. Jax, recovering from her initial strike, roared in anger and charged again. This time, Elena met him head-on. She delivered a series of rapid blows to his torso and jaw, each one landing with the precision of a seasoned fighter. Finally, a well-placed kick to his knee brought him crashing down. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. "Enough!" Jax barked, holding up a hand as he struggled to his feet. His face was a mixture of rage and begrudging respect. "You win this round, lady, but we're not done here." Elena picked up her keys and stepped toward her car. "Yes, you are," she said, her voice icy. "If you know what's good for you." She drove away, leaving the battered gang in her wake. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Elena's car sped down the desolate highway, her hand steady on the wheel despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She kept checking her rearview mirror, watching for the telltale headlights of motorcycles. They wouldn't give up so easily, she knew that much. Sure enough, a few miles down the road, the distant roar of engines grew louder. A pack of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, their lights forming an ominous constellation in the darkness. Elena took a deep breath, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. She pressed down on the accelerator, the sedan's engine protesting as it surged forward. The bikers closed in, their headlights flashing like predators' eyes. Jax was at the forefront, his face a mask of fury as he gestured to his crew to flank her. They were trying to box her in. Elena's fingers tightened on the wheel. "All right," she muttered to herself. "If it's a fight you want, it's a fight you'll get." Spotting a turnoff ahead, She veered sharply onto a dirt road, the car's tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The bikers followed, their engines roaring as they pursued her into the wilderness. The road was narrow and treacherous, lined with towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Elena's training kicked in as she maneuvered through the terrain, her mind working 2 steps ahead. She needed to even the playing field. Up ahead, she spotted a clearing. She skidded to a halt, the car's tires digging into the dirt, and jumped out, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The bikers arrived moments later, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They dismounted, spreading out as they searched for her. Jax's voice rang out, "Come on, sweetheart. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Hidden among the trees, Elena watched them with a predator's patience. She had no intention of running. Not anymore. She moved silently, her steps light on the forest floor as she circled behind them. The first biker didn't see her coming. She struck swiftly, her arm locking around his neck as she dragged him into the shadows. His muffled cries went unheard by the others, who were too busy shouting and stumbling through the darkness. One by one, Elena picked them off, using the forest to her advantage. She set traps with fallen branches, leading them into ambushes where she struck with precision. The forest became her ally, its shadows concealing her as she dismantled their ranks. Jax, realizing his crew was dwindling, grew more desperate. "Come out and face me," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the trees. Elena stepped into the clearing, her silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. "Here I am," she said, her voice calm and steady. Jax charged at her, his fists swinging wildly. But Elena was faster, her movements calculated and efficient. She dodged his attacks, countering with strikes that left him reeling. The fight was brutal, but Elena's discipline and training gave her the upper hand. Finally, Jax fell to his knees, his breath ragged. "Who the hell are you?" he gasped. Elena leaned in close, her voice cold. "The wrong person to mess with." She left him there, broken and humiliated, as she walked back to her car. As she drove away, the forest fell silent once more, the echoes of the battle fading into the night. But Elena knew this was just the beginning. The bikers weren't the type to forget, and neither was she. Elena parked her car at a secluded motel on the outskirts of a small town. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind a storm of memories she had long buried. Tonight's encounter had awakened something inside her, something she had sworn to leave behind. She stepped into the dimly lit room, locking the door behind her. A faint hum from the fluorescent light buzzed as she opened her duffel bag, pulling out a small metal case. Inside was a collection of items that spoke of her past life. A tactical knife, a satellite phone, and a worn photo of her old unit. They had been her family once, her comrades in a world of shadows. Elena's reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman haunted by her choices. She touched the edge of the photo, her mind drifting to the faces staring back. There was Mark, her mentor, whose gruff demeanor hid a heart of gold, and Layla, the sharpshooter who could take out a target from a mile away. Together, they had been unstoppable, but those days were gone. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. She hesitated before answering. "Elena," came a voice from the other end, gravelly and familiar. "It's been a while." "Too long, Gray," she replied, her voice betraying none of the emotions surging within her. Gray had been her handler, the man who had sent her on missions that blurred the line between hero and villain. "I heard about your little scuffle," Gray said. "You're making waves again." "It wasn't my choice," she snapped. "They came after me." "And now they'll keep coming," Gray said. "You know how these things work." Elena closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her. "What do you want, Gray?" "To help," he said simply. "You're not the only one who's noticed them. That gang's tied to something bigger, and you just became a part of it." "I'm not interested," she said, her voice cold. "I've left that life behind." "Have you?" Gray's question hung in the air long after the call ended. Unable to sleep, Elena spread out a map on the table, marking the locations she had seen the bikers frequent. Patterns began to emerge, connections that hinted at a larger network. Her instincts, honed by years of fieldwork, told her this was no ordinary gang. By morning, her decision was made. She packed her bag, leaving behind the motel room and the fragile illusion of peace she had built for herself. The open road stretched ahead, and with it, the promise of answers. But as she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Elena's journey into her past was just beginning, and the shadows she had tried to escape were closing in. Somewhere out there, the bikers were regrouping, their fury feeding their determination, and Elena, once again, was stepping into the darkness she had fought so hard to leave behind. Bruised, but not broken, the bikers regrouped at a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the nearest town. Jax paced the room, his face a mask of fury as he barked orders to his men. "She humiliated us," he growled. "This isn't just about payback. It's about sending a message." The bikers, though battered and wary, nodded in agreement. The humiliation of being bested by a lone woman stung deeper than any physical wound. They had a reputation to uphold, and Elena's defiance had made them look weak. Jax slammed his fist onto a table, scattering beer bottles and ashtrays. "We're tracking her down, and this time, we're not playing games." Meanwhile, Elena was already on the move. She had pieced together enough of the gang's operations to anticipate their next steps. Her time in the field had taught her that a wounded enemy was a dangerous one. They'd come for her, but she'd be ready. Elena stopped at a diner off the main highway, her eyes scanning the sparse crowd. She needed information, and places like this were gold mines for rumors. She approached the counter where a grizzled trucker was nursing a cup of coffee. "Seen any bikers around?" she asked, sliding a 20 across the counter. The trucker's eyes flicked to the bill, then to Elena. "Might have," he said slowly. "They've been causing trouble up and down this stretch. Word is they're holed up at the old mill outside of town." Elena nodded, leaving another bill as a tip before heading out. The old mill was the perfect place for an ambush. Isolated, with plenty of cover for a group like Jax's. If she played this right, she could turn their trap into her advantage. Night had fallen by the time she arrived. The mill loomed in the darkness, its silhouette broken and jagged against the moonlit sky. Elena parked her car a safe distance away and approached on foot, her movements silent and deliberate. She could hear the low murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter. They were waiting for her, but she wasn't walking into their den blind. Elena spent the next hour setting up her own traps. She used the terrain and the mill's structure to her advantage, planting makeshift tripwires and positioning debris for strategic cover. By the time she was done, the area was a minefield of surprises. The first explosion rocked the mill just after midnight. A biker had tripped one of her traps, sending a propane tank up in flames. Chaos erupted as the gang scrambled to find the source of the attack. Elena struck from the shadows, picking them off one by one. Jax, roaring in fury, rallied his men. "Find her!" he bellowed. "She's not walking out of here alive." But it was Jax who underestimated her again. Elena had drawn him into the heart of the mill, isolating him from his crew. Their final confrontation was brutal, a clash of raw strength against honed skill. Jax fought like a man possessed, but Elena's precision and strategy proved superior. As Jax lay on the ground, bloodied and defeated, Elena stood over him. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice ice cold. "Walk away, stay away, or next time, I won't leave you breathing." Jax glared at her, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he spat on the ground and muttered, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Elena said, disappearing into the shadows once more. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, she was already miles away, her mind focused on the larger threat looming ahead. Elena drove deeper into the wilderness, her car weaving through the dense forest until the dirt road ended abruptly. She stepped out into the crisp night air, her boots crunching on fallen leaves as she surveyed her surroundings. The forest was thick and dark, an impenetrable wall of trees and shadows. To most it would feel oppressive, but to Elena it was perfect. Here, she could disappear. The bikers weren't far behind. She could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Elena moved quickly, her training guiding her as she prepared for the inevitable confrontation. She scouted the area, identifying choke points and natural barriers she could use to her advantage. Minutes later, the bikers arrived, their headlights piercing the darkness like the eyes of predators. Jax was at the forefront, his face twisted in determination. They dismounted, their boots hitting the ground in unison as they fanned out. "Spread out," Jax barked. "She's here somewhere." Elena watched from her perch high in a tree, her breathing steady as she assessed their positions. They were sloppy, overconfident. It would be their downfall. Her first move was subtle but effective. She had rigged a tripwire near the entrance of the clearing. As one of the bikers stepped on it, a branch snapped back, striking him in the chest and sending him sprawling. The commotion drew the other's attention, giving Elena the opening she needed. She descended silently, her movements precise and calculated. Her first target never saw her coming. A swift blow to the back of the neck rendered him unconscious. She dragged him into the shadows before disappearing again. Panic began to ripple through the group. "Stay together," Jax shouted, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "She's trying to pick us off." But it was too late. Elena was a ghost in the darkness, striking and retreating with lethal efficiency. She used the forest to her advantage, leading the bikers deeper into the maze of trees and confusion. Every sound, every shadow became a weapon in her arsenal. One by one, the bikers fell. Some stumbled into traps she had set earlier, holes camouflaged with leaves, branches rigged to swing with force. Others succumbed to her relentless attacks. Her movements were a blur of precision, each strike designed to incapacitate without hesitation. Jax, realizing his crew was dwindling, called for a retreat. "Fall back! We need to regroup," he bellowed, but Elena wasn't about to let them escape. She confronted Jax in the center of the clearing, her silhouette illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees. "It's over," she said, her voice steady and calm. "You're done." Jax snarled, his fists clenched as he stepped forward. "Not yet." Their fight was brutal and raw, a clash of strength and skill. Jax fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but Elena's discipline and training gave her the edge. She anticipated his moves, countering with strikes that left him reeling. Finally, Jax fell to his knees, his breath ragged. Jax stumbled through the forest, his breath heavy and labored. The once mighty leader of the biker gang now resembled a wounded animal, his arrogance replaced by desperation. He clutched at his side where Elena's well-placed strike had left a searing ache. Around him, the forest was silent, the shadows seemingly alive, closing in like predators. He wasn't alone. 3 of his men, battered and bloodied, trailed behind him. They had survived Elena's onslaught, but the terror she inspired had shaken their loyalty. Jax turned, his eyes blazing despite his exhaustion. "We're not running," he snarled. "She's just one woman." One of the men, a wiry biker with a deep gash across his forehead, muttered, "One woman, who took out almost all of us. This is madness." Jax grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a tree. "You want to walk away? Go ahead," he spat, "but you'll be nothing but a coward who let a woman ruin us." The biker didn't reply, but the fear in his eyes was answer enough. Jax released him and turned back to the path ahead. "We're finishing this," he growled. Elena watched them from the shadows, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had driven them to this point, her strategy unfolding exactly as planned. The group was fragmented, their morale shattered. Now it was time to end it. She moved silently, her footsteps masked by the soft forest floor. She wasn't aiming to kill, That wasn't her way, but she would make sure Jax and his crew never dared cross her again. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the forest. One of the bikers had triggered another of Elena's traps, a weighted branch that swung down with brutal force, knocking him unconscious. The other two spun around, panic etched on their faces. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. Jax tightened his grip on the machete he had taken from one of their bikes. "She's playing with us," he said, his voice low. "Stay close." Elena struck again, this time targeting the wiry biker. She darted out from the shadows, a blur of motion, and delivered a sharp blow to his temple with the hilt of her knife. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. The last remaining man let out a yell, firing blindly into the trees with a pistol. The gunshots echoed through the forest, but they didn't hit their mark. Elena had already disappeared back into the shadows. "Coward!" Jax bellowed, his voice raw with rage. "Face me!" Elena stepped into the clearing, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She held no weapon. Her hands relaxed at her sides. "I'm right here," she said, her voice calm and unyielding. Jax charged at her, swinging the machete with all the strength he could muster. But Elena was faster. She sidestepped his wild swing, landing a precise kick to his knee that sent him staggering. The machete fell from his hands, clattering to the ground. Their fight was relentless, a brutal clash of strength and skill. Jax relied on brute force, his fists swinging with the desperation of a cornered beast. Elena, by contrast, was methodical and precise, each movement calculated to exploit his weaknesses. She dodged a punch and countered with a series of strikes to his ribs and jaw. Jax faltered, his balance slipping as he swung again, this time slower, weaker. Elena seized the opportunity, delivering a devastating elbow strike that sent him crashing to the ground. Jax lay there gasping for breath, his body refusing to obey his commands. He looked up at Elena, who stood over him, her expression unreadable. "It's over," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You think you've won?" Jax spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "This isn't over." Elena knelt beside him, her gaze piercing. "Yes, it is," she said. "I could end this right now, but I'm giving you a choice. Walk away. Leave this life behind. If I ever see you again, there won't be a choice next time." Jax stared at her, his pride and fury warring with the undeniable truth of her words. Finally, he let out a ragged breath and nodded. "Fine," he muttered. "You win." Elena stood and stepped back, watching as Jax struggled to his feet. He limped away, his defeat complete, the remnants of his gang trailing behind him. The forest grew quiet once more, the echoes of the battle fading into the night. Elena took a deep breath, her body aching but her mind sharp. This fight was over, but she knew it wouldn't be the last. She turned and disappeared into the shadows, the moonlight guiding her path forward. Elena returned to her safe house, a secluded cabin hidden deep in the forest, to regroup and recover. She sat at a worn wooden table, her laptop open in front of her, its screen casting a pale glow in the dark room. The events of the night still lingered in her mind, but she knew she couldn't afford to rest just yet. Jax's defeat wasn't the end of this battle. It was merely the beginning. Using the intel she had gathered from the bikers' radios and phones she had confiscated during her earlier encounters, Elena began piecing together the puzzle. The gang wasn't just a ragtag group of thugs. They were part of a larger, more organized network. Names and locations flashed on her screen as she traced their communications and connections. One name stood out: Viktor Malinov. A shadowy figure linked to multiple criminal enterprises, including arms trafficking and human smuggling. Elena's stomach churned as she read the details. The gang she had faced was just one arm of Malinov's sprawling operation, and Jax's actions were likely part of a larger, coordinated effort. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. Elena tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at her side. She moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. A single sedan pulled up to the cabin, its headlights cutting through the night. The driver stepped out, and Elena's grip on her weapon relaxed slightly. "Gray," she muttered under her breath. Gray had been her handler during her time with the Covert Unit, a man who operated in the murky waters of espionage and black ops. He approached the cabin cautiously, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't a threat. Elena opened the door but kept her weapon in view. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone sharp. Gray stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "I figured you'd need backup," he said, his voice gravelly, "and from the look of things, I was right." Elena crossed her arms. "I don't need your help." Gray smirked. "You've always been stubborn, but even you can't take down Malinov alone." She narrowed her eyes. "You know about him?" Gray nodded, pulling a file from his jacket and tossing it onto the table. "More than you think. Malinov's been on our radar for years, but he's always managed to stay one step ahead. He's got connections everywhere. Politicians, law enforcement, even international agencies. Taking him down won't be easy." Elena flipped through the file, her mind racing. Gray was right. Malinov's reach was vast, his network a web of corruption and power, but she had no intention of backing down. "What's your angle?" she asked, looking up at Gray. He sighed, leaning against the wall. "Let's just say I've got a score to settle with Malinov, too. He's cost me good people, friends. I'm not here to babysit you, Elena. I'm here to make sure this bastard pays." Elena studied him for a moment before nodding. "Fine, but we do this my way." The next few hours were spent strategizing. They mapped out Malinov's known operations, identifying weak points and vulnerabilities. It became clear that their first target would be a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a hub for the gang's arms shipments. As dawn broke, Elena and Gray prepared to move out. The air between them was tense but charged with determination. They both knew the risks, but neither was willing to back down. The drive to the warehouse was silent, each lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, they parked a safe distance away and surveyed the area. The warehouse was heavily guarded, with armed men patrolling the perimeter. It was a fortress, but Elena saw opportunities in its design. "We'll split up," she said, her voice low. "I'll create a distraction while you take out the guards on the north side. Once we're inside, we disable their communications and gather as much intel as we can." Gray nodded, his expression grim. "Let's do this." As the operation began, Elena felt a familiar adrenaline surge through her veins. This was what she had been trained for, the life she had tried to leave behind. She moved like a shadow, her actions precise and deadly. Together, she and Gray dismantled the gang's defenses, their teamwork seamless despite the years that had passed since they last worked together. Inside the warehouse, they uncovered a trove of information, ledgers, encrypted files, and shipments labeled with destinations that hinted at Malinov's broader operations. But their success was short-lived. An alarm blared, and within moments, reinforcements arrived. "Time to go," Gray said, grabbing a handful of documents. Elena nodded, covering their escape as they fought their way out. The mission had been a success, but it was clear that the battle against Malinov was far from over. As they drove away, the first hints of a plan began forming in Elena's mind. "This isn't just about taking him down," she said. "It's about dismantling everything he stands for." Gray glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. "Now that's the Elena I remember. Let's get to work." The road ahead was uncertain, but Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was just beginning, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The long drive away from the warehouse gave Elena time to process the magnitude of the fight ahead. The documents they had stolen painted a vivid picture of Viktor Malinov's empire. Secret offshore accounts, encrypted communications, and a network that spanned continents. It wasn't just a fight against a single man, it was a battle against a well-oiled machine. The weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. Gray glanced at her as he drove, his hands steady on the wheel. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," he said. "Because I am," Elena replied, her voice quiet. "Taking down Malinov won't just be dangerous, it's going to be messy, and it's not the kind of fight you come out of unscathed." "You've done it before," Gray said, his tone confident. "You faced worse odds and won." "That was different," she said. "Back then, I had a team, resources, and the backing of an entire operation. Now, it's just you and me." Gray didn't respond immediately, but the silence was heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, he said, "You're not wrong, but you're also not alone. There are still people who believe in the kind of work we used to do. You just have to be willing to reach out." Elena considered his words as they pulled into a motel parking lot. They needed a safe place to regroup and plan their next move. Inside the small, dimly lit room, they spread out the stolen documents and began piecing together a strategy. Malinov's operations were complex, but they had one glaring vulnerability: a reliance on key personnel. Elena identified several high-ranking members of his network: logistics coordinators, financial handlers, and enforcers. If they could dismantle the chain of command, the entire operation would start to crumble. "We take out the legs before we go for the head," Elena said, tracing a line on the map. "Cut off his support system, and he'll be exposed." Gray nodded, his expression grim. "It's a good plan, but it's going to draw attention. Malinov won't take this lying down." "I'm counting on it," Elena said, her eyes sharp. "If he's focused on us, he'll make mistakes, and that's when we take him down." Their first target was a warehouse in a bustling port city, where Malinov's logistics coordinator, Andrei Volkov, managed shipments. According to the intel, Volkov would be there overseeing a critical transaction. It was the perfect opportunity to strike. As they approached the port, Elena and Gray donned disguises, hard hats, and reflective vests to blend in with the workers. The area was a hive of activity, with cranes moving containers and forklifts zipping back and forth. Amid the chaos, it was easy to remain inconspicuous. Elena spotted Volkov near the loading docks, his burly frame and loud voice making him easy to identify. He was flanked by 2 armed guards, but his attention was focused on a clipboard in his hand. "There he is," Elena murmured. "We need to isolate him." Gray nodded. "I'll create a distraction. You move in and grab him." Gray slipped away, and moments later, a forklift suddenly veered off course, crashing into a stack of containers with a deafening clang. Workers shouted and scattered, and Volkov turned to see what the commotion was about. In that moment of distraction, Elena moved. She approached from behind, her steps swift and silent. Before the guards could react, she struck, disarming one and incapacitating the other with a precise blow. Volkov barely had time to register what was happening before Elena had him in a chokehold, dragging him into the shadows. "What? Who are you?" Volkov gasped, struggling against her grip. "The person asking the questions," Elena said coldly, "and if you want to walk away from this, you're going to answer them." She forced him into a nearby storage room where Gray was waiting. They tied him to a chair, his protests silenced by a gag. Elena leaned in close, her eyes hard. "Here's how this works. You talk, or I make sure you never talk again." Volkov's resolve crumbled quickly. Under pressure, he revealed critical details about Malinov's operations: safe houses, shipment schedules, and the locations of other key players. Elena recorded everything, her mind already formulating their next steps. By the time they left the port, the gears of Malinov's empire had already begun to grind to a halt. The intel they had gathered would allow them to strike at the heart of his network, piece by piece. As they drove away, Gray glanced at Elena. "You were right," he said. "Taking out the legs first. It's already working." Elena didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, she said, "This isn't about being right. It's about finishing what we started. Malinov thinks he's untouchable, but he's about to find out just how wrong he is. The fight was far from over, but for the first time Elena felt like they were making progress. The shadows of her past loomed large, but she was no longer running from them. She was facing them head-on, determined to bring them into the light. Elena and Gray worked tirelessly, dismantling Viktor Malinov's network piece by piece. Each strike brought them closer to their ultimate target, but also increased the danger they faced. Their latest success, a raid on a safe house storing critical financial records, had forced Malinov's hand. Now his empire was teetering, and he was coming after them with everything he had. Their final destination was a private compound in the heart of the city, an opulent fortress where Malinov conducted his most secure operations. The compound was heavily guarded, with security teams patrolling the perimeter and surveillance cameras monitoring every angle. For most, it would have been impenetrable. For Elena, it was a challenge she couldn't resist. The plan was simple in theory, but required flawless execution. Gray would create a diversion at the front gate, drawing the guards' attention, while Elena infiltrated the compound from the rear. Once inside, she would disable the security systems and make her way to Malinov's office. The goal was to retrieve the encrypted files that would expose his entire operation. As they approached the compound in the dead of night, the tension between them was palpable. Gray broke the silence. "You sure about this?" Elena nodded. "This is the only way to end it." Gray sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Just make sure you get out of there." Elena offered him a faint smile before slipping out of the car and disappearing into the shadows. She moved with the precision of a predator, her every step calculated to avoid detection. Scaling the wall at the rear of the compound, she landed silently on the other side, her eyes scanning the area for guards. Gray's diversion began moments later. Explosions echoed from the front gate and the guards rushed toward the commotion. Elena used the opportunity to slip inside the main building. The hallways were eerily silent, the luxurious decor contrasting sharply with the danger lurking around every corner. She reached the security room and quickly disabled the cameras and alarms. The flickering monitors went dark, and the compound was plunged into chaos as the guards scrambled to respond to the breach. Elena navigated the labyrinthine corridors, her goal clear. She reached Malinov's office and pushed the door open, her weapon drawn. The room was empty, but a large safe stood against the wall. She approached it, her hands steady as she began working on the lock. Behind her, the door creaked open. Elena spun around, her instincts saving her as a shot rang out, narrowly missing her. Malinov stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand and a cruel smile on his face. "You're persistent," he said, his voice calm despite the situation. "But you should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." Elena didn't respond. She fired, forcing Malinov to duck behind the desk. The room erupted into chaos as the two exchanged fire, each move calculated and deadly. Malinov was no amateur, but Elena's training gave her the edge. She anticipated his moves, forcing him into a defensive position. Finally, she managed to disarm him, her gun trained on his chest as he raised his hands in surrender. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. Malinov chuckled darkly. "You think this ends with me? You're naive. My operation is bigger than you can imagine. Cut off one head, and another will take its place." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll cut them all off." She fired, not to kill but to incapacitate, the shot rendering him unconscious. She turned back to the safe, cracking it open and retrieving the encrypted files. The evidence inside was enough to dismantle his entire operation, to expose every corrupt official and criminal he worked with. Gray's voice crackled over her earpiece. "Guards are regrouping. You need to move now." Elena grabbed the files and made her way out, her movements swift and efficient. She reunited with Gray at the extraction point, the sounds of sirens growing louder in the distance. They drove away, leaving the chaos of the compound behind. As they reached the safety of their safe house, Elena handed the files to Gray. "This is it," she said. "Everything we need to take him down." Gray nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "We've got one shot at this. Let's make it count." For the first time in years, Elena felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but the scales were finally tipping in their favor. She had faced her past, and now she was ready to secure a future free from its shadows. The encrypted files they had retrieved from Malinov's safe were the linchpin in dismantling his operation. Elena and Gray spent days combing through the documents, decoding layers of encryption, and piecing together the web of corruption Malinov had built. Each revelation was more damning than the last: bribes to high-ranking officials, covert deals with international arms dealers, and detailed plans for future operations. Gray forwarded the files to trusted allies in law enforcement and intelligence agencies, ensuring Malinov's empire would collapse from within. The fallout was immediate. Arrests were made across the globe, and news outlets erupted with stories of the takedown. For Elena, it was both a victory and a moment of reckoning. Sitting in the safe house one evening, she stared at the flickering television screen. The face of Viktor Malinov flashed across it, his mugshot displayed alongside headlines proclaiming the end of his reign. Gray walked in, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You did it," he said, placing a cup in front of her. "We did it," Elena corrected, though her tone was distant. The victory felt hollow in some ways. She had spent so long fighting, she wasn't sure what came next. Gray sat across from her, studying her expression. "You don't look happy." "It's not that," Elena said after a long pause. "I'm relieved, but this was my life for so long. Now that it's over, I don't know what to do." Gray chuckled. "You find something new, or someone. You don't have to carry the weight of the world anymore." Elena smirked, but her eyes softened. "Easy for you to say." "Maybe," he admitted, "but you've earned a fresh start. Take it." The next morning, Elena stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the quiet town where their safe house was located. The light felt warmer, brighter, as if signaling a new chapter. She knew Gray was right. It was time to let go of the past and look forward. Elena left the safe house later that day, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She and Gray had agreed to part ways, each pursuing their own paths. Gray would continue his work, using his connections to fight corruption from the shadows. Elena, however, was ready to step into the light. She drove for hours, the open road stretching endlessly before her. The world felt different now, less oppressive. For the first time in years, she felt free. But her newfound freedom came with a sense of purpose. She wasn't running anymore, she was moving forward. Her journey took her to a small coastal town, a place she had visited once years ago during a rare moment of peace. It was quiet, with charming streets and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. Elena found a modest house overlooking the ocean and decided it would be home. In the weeks that followed, she began rebuilding her life. She spent her mornings walking along the beach and her afternoons fixing up the house. The scars of her past remained, but they no longer defined her. She was more than the battles she had fought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena sat on her porch, a cup of tea in hand. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from Gray. "They got Malinov's second-in-command today. Looks like the cleanup is going well. Hope you're doing okay." Elena smiled, typing a quick reply. "I'm good. Take care of yourself." She put the phone down and leaned back, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Her fight with Malinov had been the culmination of years of struggle, but it wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something new. As the stars emerged in the night sky, Elena allowed herself to dream of a future unburdened by the shadows of her past. She didn't know where the journey would take her, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer defined by what she had endured. She was free, and the possibilities were endless.